This is a history of Western thought number 23 on the subject of Gnosticism. The origins of Gnosticism as a movement are difficult to discern. We don't know exactly when Gnosticism began, but it seems to have shown up at some point during the 1st century AD, during the early Christian era. Now, this movement known as Gnosticism seems to have appeared by the time that the New Testament is being written. There are a couple different books within the New Testament that seem to be interacting with early Gnostic ideas, or what has sometimes been referred to as a proto-Gnosticism. We see this in St. Paul's letter to the Colossians, or in the book of 1 John, as well as in the rest of the Johannine writings. Though there is a bit of debate specifically about the proto-Gnostic nature of the group that Paul's writing against in the book of Colossians. Now, Gnosticism may have had its roots within Judaism prior to Christianity. There are some scholars that make that argument, but this is unproven. We are not exactly sure, though we do know that there were Jewish Gnostic groups as well as Christian Gnostic groups. So these early Gnostic groups, from what we can see in this early era, seem to have been largely dominated by early Jewish self-identified Christians. And so these seem to be not those Christian groups that are composed primarily of Gentiles, as the Christian church is made up of both Jewish and Gentile groups, which have kind of their own distinctive tendencies in the early church. Now, the Gnostics grew significantly in their influence and in their presence and prominence within the 2nd and 3rd centuries following the completion of the New Testament. And the Gnostics are perhaps most well known, and certainly most well known today, for the Gospels that they wrote. And so the Gnostics wrote their own versions of the Gospels. These are often known as, well, the Gnostic Gospels. And not just Gospels, but we have a number of other texts as well. And these Gospels tend to reiterate certain stories that are present within the 4 Gospels in the New Testament, but they put their own unique spin and teachings on these stories. And they include several stories or ideas about the life of Jesus that are not at all included in those that we have present in the New Testament. Now, the Gnostics themselves were not a unified group. So as we're talking about Gnostics, we're speaking about a large number of sects. And each of these sects has their own particular set of teachings. They have their own leader who is passing on what were supposedly secret teachings of Jesus. And so core to the Gnostic identity was this idea that there are teachings of Jesus which were supposedly publicly passed on by what later is described as the Orthodox Church. And then there were these secret kinds of teachings, these teachings that were not so public, that were passed on privately from Jesus to another person, to another person, to another person. Now, these ideas of the Gnostics were rejected by early Orthodox Christians. And those early Orthodox Christians often pointed to the fact that those who studied with Jesus, those who were apostles, were very public in their own teachings and did not affirm the kinds of teachings that were present within these early Gnostic writings. And so we have anti-Gnostic writings from a lot of the earliest Christian writers, for example, in Irenaeus or Tertullian or Origen. Now, the ideas of the Gnostics continued to exist throughout the medieval period, through a variety of different neo-Gnostic sects, though it is a bit difficult to trace some clear line of derivation from those early Gnostics through the medieval period. And there are still many Gnostic ideas in the world today, though again, it's not always easy to trace some clear line of historical derivation from the Gnostics to today. But with the rise of the New Age movement in the 20th century, many of those Gnostic Gospels and Gnostic conceptions were once again brought to the forefront of people's minds and beliefs, so interpreted and applied in quite a different context than they would have been in those first few centuries. Now, the word Gnostic, or the title Gnostic, arises from the word gnosis, which means knowledge in Greek. And so the reason these groups are called Gnostics is because they had a very particular perception of the role of knowledge within religion. For the Gnostics, salvation is essentially about a growth in knowledge. Salvation is really centered in the intellect, the deriving of what were supposedly these secret teachings of Jesus that were taught to whoever the leader of that particular group was, who then passed down this secret knowledge to others. And so there was a kind of direct teaching of Jesus to a particular individual, who then taught these things to another individual, who taught these things to another individual, and the teachings were retained within the group itself. And so in order to have access to this secret knowledge, which was what salvation was largely comprised of, you would have to derive this knowledge by joining this particular sect and getting information. And that information often had to do with particular angels that were being addressed for distinct kinds of benefits. Another characteristic of the Gnostic groups, by and large, was a dualistic conception of reality. Dualism can mean a number of different things in philosophy, but here we're talking about dualism in their perception of God. Many of the Gnostic sects believed that there was a good God and a kind of evil God. This good God was the God who oversaw the realm of the spiritual, and the spiritual for the Gnostics was the decidedly non-physical. And then there was this evil being, or some kind of evil force, that controlled the material world. And so this dualistic conception that arises in the Gnostics pitted the material world against the spiritual world, arguing for the superiority of the immaterial over the material world, often viewing the material world as something that should be escaped from rather than embraced or redeemed. Now, in one particular thinker who was often kind of associated with the Gnostics, though he himself wasn't really a Gnostic, but affirmed very similar ideas, was a man named Marcion. And Marcion made the argument that there is a distinct God in the Old Testament that's different from the God of the New Testament. The God of the Old Testament was that material God, that kind of evil force, and the God of the New Testament was the God of love and grace, and this was the God of this immaterial reality. Now, there were different Gnostic groups, as I've mentioned, that believed different things, and so others were a little bit more moderately dualistic, maybe not as strictly dualistic as someone like a Marcion. And in these more moderately dualistic Gnostic groups, there was an evil force called the demiurge that was lesser than God. So this would be a view that says that yes, there are these two opposing forces, but they're not equally opposing forces. In other words, God, the immaterial good God, is the one who is truly in control of reality, and then there is this demiurge, this lesser being that controls the material or the physical. Now, all of this led to a general distrust of the physical. This meant that salvation, as salvation is an act of the intellect, salvation is essentially about escaping the material. And so through the mind or through the intellect, we rise above our material reality that surrounds us. And so through the growth in knowledge, we can grow out of the prison that we have that is within our bodies. Another essential idea for Gnosticism is this idea of aeons. Now, the Gnostics had this perception of reality dependent upon a chain of being. And in this chain of being, there was the source of being, or being itself, which we would identify as God, which they referred to as a monad. And so there was this kind of singular source of being. And then there were emanations, these emanations that came down from that one being. And think about it as like the sun. And you have the sun as an object, and that sun as an object has rays that emanate from it. And so the rays are not identical with the sun, but they only exist through the sun. And so these emanations are like the rays of the sun. And so as we have this monad, who is the God at the top of being, this chain of being, we have then lesser beings and lesser beings and lesser beings and lesser beings. And so the farther you get from the source, the sun, who is this monad, the less being that you have. The Gnostics had a very detailed list of particular powers and angels and spiritual forces, and kind of teased out how all of these spiritual forces related in this kind of chain or ladder of being, leading all the way up to this monad at the top of the chain of being. Now, the goal of this salvation that we have spoken of, that is through knowledge for the Gnostics, or the escaping of the physical, is also a reuniting with this monad. And so the purpose or the end of all of this knowledge that is gained, or the escaping of the material, is that one might be reunited with the one, the monad, who is the source of all reality. Something that you're going to see among the Gnostics is this language of Pleroma, or this language of fullness. And so the Pleroma is this kind of fullness of these divine powers that emanate, again, from the monad. And these are these various angels and orders of angels. And so there is a sense in which this reunion with the monad kind of comes through these orders of angels. And so in these Gnostic groups, you get kind of secret knowledge of one group of angels or another group of angels, so that you might, ascend this ladder, eventually reaching reunion with the monad, with God. So prayers to these different beings within this chain of being, those that are above you, help you to ascend this ladder higher. This is all a form of monism. Monism meaning that all things are essentially one. And so for the Gnostics, there is no real distinction in reality between God and those rays. There is in some sense, but all things ultimately are part of the one, that is God, or the monad. So how then do they view Jesus? Because, as I said, Gnostics were by and large groups that claimed to be Christians, or they claimed to be followers of Jesus in one way or another. Now, there were different ways of perceiving of Jesus within this particular system. And Jesus was generally seen, or often seen, as one of these higher aeons, but not identical with the monad. And so it may have been seen in some of these groups that you have God the Father as this monad at the top of the chain of being, and then Jesus is just below him. So Jesus is one that is lesser than the Father, but he is one that human beings need to access and get secret knowledge about, so that they can communicate with and go through him into their union with this one monad. Now, another point in terms of their view of Jesus that's essential is to recognize that for the Gnostics, if Jesus is this Redeemer figure, and that is used in a very loose sense, because in the way that he's Redeemer in a Gnostic conception is not through atoning for sins, but through this passing on of knowledge, more of as a teacher than anything else. But if he is this Savior figure, then he can't really have a physical body, because as we've talked about, the physical is something that is relegated to that kind of evil realm. This is what we want to escape from. And so if Jesus is a higher being than we are, then he must necessarily be one that is not physical. And so this leads to a view known as Docetism. Docetism is the view that says that Jesus did not actually have a physical body, but that he had the mere appearance of physicality. But Jesus was really more like a kind of ghostly figure that could show himself and look like he had a physical body, but that was apparent rather than real. And then finally, we have Gnostic Ethics. Now, the Gnostics didn't just have one single unified form of ethics. They had really two different ways of approaching ethics. And this arises from their belief that the physical was not inherently a good thing, and that we needed to escape the physical. The physical is not really what matters. You kind of go in two directions here. The one direction might be to say that because you're not really your body, you're not identical with your body, then it doesn't really matter what you do with your body. And so these Gnostic groups would say, well, don't even worry about it. If you're going to be gluttonous, doesn't matter, because that's just an issue of your physical body, and what really matters is the internal self, or the internal soul. So as long as you have your internal soul aligned with this retaining of knowledge, your bodily desires and bodily actions are kind of irrelevant. The more common way of looking at this, though, among the Gnostics was the opposite of that, which is to say that the body is a prison for the soul. And if the body is a prison, it's a negative thing, that means that you have to discipline your body and you have to kind of abuse your body. And so for many of the Gnostics, salvation, along with this gaining of knowledge, also meant the suppression of bodily senses altogether. And so some of them were very, very strongly ascetic. They abused their bodies. They practiced very strong and serious rituals of abstinence from food or sex or all sorts of other bodily pleasures and enjoyments. Ultimately, though, Gnostic ethics is really about the gaining of knowledge more than anything else. Because if salvation is about knowledge, that means that our life should be not so much about acts of love and service to the neighbor, but knowledge and the retaining and maintenance of knowledge. This becomes really the goal and purpose of all of life. So there are some of the basics there of the Gnostic system. Thanks so much for watching. Make sure you subscribe if you have not already, and check out the rest of the videos on this playlist. God bless.